Thank you very much, Dr. Abbas. My presentation is going to be on the Summit of the Future, Intellectual Property and the Sustainable Development Goals. As is always the case at QT, I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and the Yugara as the First Nations owners of the lands where QT now stands. We pay respect to their elders' laws, customs and creation spirits, and we recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. QT at the moment is very keen on setting up a new faculty focused on Indigenous knowledges. As you'll see from my talk, Indigenous intellectual property is a really kind of important and critical issue, and I think there's also kind of larger questions around Indigenous rights in terms of some of the topics that we've been looking at today. So just to begin with, I guess I've done work on intellectual property and sustainable development for a couple of decades. I've often been the convener or facilitator of events around the topic. So 20 years ago, I was running an event on the WIPO development agenda. 2018, 2019, I ran a big conference at QT looking at intellectual property and sustainable development. I kind of caucused a series of workshops in 2022, 2023 to kind of develop a book looking at the intersections between intellectual property and these 17 goals. So for those of you who haven't come across intellectual property before, it covers copyright law, which deals with cultural creations. It deals with trademarks, which deal with distinctive signs. It covers patents, which relate to scientific inventions. It also relates to trade secrets, which provide for protection of confidential information. And then there's some sui generis, one-of-a-kind IP systems as well. So geographical indications, plant breeders' rights. I guess our view is that there's lots of intersections and interconnections between intellectual property and the 17 goals. I guess traditionally, there's been a few areas that have received a lot of attention. So copyright law and access to knowledge has received a lot of attention. There's also been a great interest in patent law and access to essential medicines, particularly with the HIV/AIDS crisis, tuberculosis, malaria, and more recently the COVID crisis. There's also been a lot of interest in technology transfer in intellectual property. I guess in our collection, we kind of gathered together 30 plus people from an array of places around the world, covering a whole different system of disciplines to kind of interrogate how each of the goals related to intellectual property. And I guess in that context, as we were kind of finishing the book, we kind of drew some larger conclusions, and we were looking at Antonio Guterres' common agenda, efforts, and some of his work to establish the Summit of the Future. Or it was kind of originally called a People's Pact for the Future, was one of its kind of key ideas. Guterres, I guess, had a number of different objectives and goals, but amongst other things, he was very much interested in dealing with science and technology and cooperation in relation to digital technologies. I guess kind of looking at the Pact for the Future, I've been kind of digging through the zero draft and drafts 1, 2, 3, 4 and the final text. And really, the Pact for the Future is a pamphlet. You know, it's kind of a document with many layers. Some bits have been erased, some have been written over. There's new text that has been kind of added. So there have been things that have been subtracted during the negotiations, and there's also been things that have been added. And I guess we've got a sense of that from some of the previous talks, which have kind of highlighted how certain text has been watered down, how certain text has been reframed in certain ways. I just want to look at 4 topics. I want to kind of look at how the text on intellectual property evolved and then disappeared. I want to have a quick discussion of technology transfer and benefit sharing. I'd really like to focus on digital public goods in the Global Digital Compact. And finally, I'd just like to kind of discuss how Indigenous intellectual property kind of has been added to the discussion in the Pact for the Future and Indigenous rights, so kind of got a specific mention in relation to the Declaration on Future Generations. So intellectual property and sustainable development. There is a new Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organisation, Daren Tang, who is from Singapore, and he took over from Francis Gehry, the kind of Australian Director General who had been in charge for many years. Daren had a speaking part at the Summit of the Future and said, throughout history, when faced with challenges, it has been human ingenuity, ideas and innovation that has allowed us to overcome and to succeed. To put the SDGs back on track, we need to harness the power of intellectual property as a catalyst to unleash innovation and creativity in the service of the SDGs. And really he kind of made a pitch for the importance of intellectual property. He maintained that as more and more countries use digitalization, entrepreneurship, research and technology to drive growth, IP is shifting from a technical area of interest only to experts to an increasingly important cornerstone of economic and trade policy and a catalyst for growth and development. He kind of provided some examples. He kind of said that the IP regime was dealing with cutting edge issues like AI and IP. Secondly, he kind of emphasised that, they were bringing IP to the grassroots. And thirdly, they kind of emphasised WIPO Green kind of helped share green technologies. So he kind of reiterated, to conclude, IP is not just about technical IP laws, but also a catalyst for progress, opportunity and sustainability. WIPO pledges to work with everyone to harness the power of innovation and creativity to support the aims of the summit. However, if you kind of look at the texts associated with the Pact for the Future, you don't necessarily see intellectual property being given that central cornerstone role in terms of the operation of the Pact for the Future. So the Zero draft had a little paragraph on intellectual property, and then that expanded in the third revision to this text, which is very kind of beige placeholder text. We will uphold IP rights to support developing countries achieve sustainable development. We recognise the importance of IP rights to progress on science, technology and innovation and the achievement of sustainable development. We decide to protect and enforce IP rights, to promote technological innovation, build trust and contribute to the transfer and dissemination of technology on mutual agreed terms. And we uphold the rights and obligations enshrined in relevant agreements related to trade and intellectual property rights, including the right of member states to use the flexibilities contained therein, recognising the need to support developing countries in benefiting from scientific and technological innovations. So there's a kind of an effort there to try to reconcile some of the competing political agendas around intellectual property. On the one hand, there's this kind of rhetoric about the importance of intellectual property protection and enforcement. And then there's also a countervailing effort to recognise that intellectual property flexibilities can promote certain important public goods. Some commentators were quite critical of this text. So Alan T. Hohen, who is a Dutch access to medicines expert, formerly the head of the MSF Access to Medicines project, said that the text failed to kind of grapple with the very dynamic political debates that were happening in relation to intellectual property, particularly during the COVID crisis. So she said that it was very peculiar in the wake of the COVID crisis that the Pact for the Future kind of had such a benign vision of intellectual property. And she argued that really it should do something much more substantive. Equally, the Creative Commons and other copyright user groups were kind of the view that there needed to be kind of stronger text there to accelerate progress in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. Instead, what happened was that in the final Pact for the Future, the text on intellectual property was erased, it vanished, it evaporated. So there are kind of traces of intellectual property through the Pact for the Future, and sometimes it's kind of the underlying root cause of some of the conflicts that it's talking about. But there's this unwillingness to address the topic. And we've certainly seen this in the past as well, you know, during some of the international climate talks, during some of the biodiversity talks. You've had developed countries like the United States try to block text altogether. An Egyptian negotiator in the climate talks once said that intellectual property is like Voldemort, the villain from Harry Potter. You're not allowed to talk about it. So it's kind of very peculiar that the Pact for the Future doesn't deal with intellectual property, even though it has a great bearing upon the future. The agreement does have some text on technology transfer. Daren Tang kind of tried to make the pitch that WIPO kind of played a key role in facilitating technology transfer through existing mechanisms like WIPO Green. I'd counter by saying, well, WIPO Green has been very long established, but it's quite a modest mechanism. It's not really helping transfer technologies or share technologies at a scale to be meaningful. The preamble to science, technology, innovation, digital cooperation emphasises particularly some of the issues around the Great Divide in terms of access to technologies, and it says that sharing science, technology and innovation is essential, and innovations and scientific breakthrough that can make our planet more sustainable and our countries more prosperous and resilient should be affordable and accessible to all. And you know, Action 29 tries to embody that, but if you actually kind of look at the means by which it hopes to realise some of those actions in terms of sharing science, technology, innovation, there's a kind of a bit of a gap, both in terms of finance, but also in terms of, you know, actually ensuring that there is really transfer of environmentally sound technologies. There's a few other clauses of the Pact for the Future that also kind of talk about technology and technology transfer as well. I just wanted to kind of also pick up the disappearance of another kind of important concept. Antonio Guterres, when he released our common agenda, had this very strong emphasis about the importance of protection of global commons and the promotion of global public goods. And those concepts seem to have kind of eroded away. So you kind of had graphics like that in the common agenda text. But, you know, in the final Pact for the Future, there is no mention of the commons and there's no mention of global public goods. There was a rearguard action to try to preserve references to open science, and there is a kind of a reference to open science and open innovation and open source technologies in the text. The Global Digital Compact is kind of interesting because it has a whole section in which it kind of promotes open access, open data, open source software, open artificial models. And it kind of talks about digital public goods, so not global public goods, a somewhat more confined concept of digital public goods. So the Global Digital Compact really has this kind of vision of open models, potentially, of sharing intellectual property. I just want to kind of wrap up by talking a little bit about Indigenous intellectual property. There's long been international, regional and national efforts to try to get better recognition of Indigenous intellectual property. UNDRIP has Article 31, which has a very kind of broad and expansive vision of what should be protected as Indigenous intellectual property as part of a larger array of Indigenous rights. A number of years ago, along with a number of colleagues, we kind of looked at various different dimensions of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and looking at different aspects of Indigenous intellectual property. Daren Tang at the Summit for the Future kind of lauded the recent success of the passage of an agreement on genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge, which is quite a limited agreement and follows on from recognition of the protection of traditional knowledge under the Convention on Biological Diversities and under the Nagoya Protocol. The zero draft of the Pact for the Future had no reference to Indigenous peoples at all, and then there were strenuous objections to that silence, and after the first revision there was this new text that was added dealing with Indigenous, traditional and local knowledge. It says we recognise the need for science, technology and innovation to be adapted and made relevant to local needs and circumstances, including for local communities, traditional Afro-descendant populations and Indigenous peoples, in line with the principle of free, prior and informed consent as appropriate. And we decide to foster synergies between science and technology and traditional, local, Afro-descendant and Indigenous knowledge systems, practices and capacities. It's a bit of a stub of a text though. You don't really have any idea about how that vision is going to be actually implemented by nation states or at an international level, whether it kind of adds anything to some of the existing initiatives in the field. It's a little bit peculiar in terms of it's a statement of an aspiration which is not matched by any enforcement mechanism or any system of implementation. There are some brief references to Indigenous peoples in the Global Digital Compact. As we might hear later, there's also a declaration on future generations. The Declaration of Future Generations has some very expansive text on Indigenous rights, much more expansive than what is in the Pact for the Future. It kind of talks about the need to recognise, respect, promote and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, which is kind of an interesting kind of statement compared to the other texts. So in conclusion, the Pact for the Future is a kind of a curious document, a kind of a pamphlet. It kind of flickers between emphasising the importance of intellectual property and trying to erase intellectual property. In the end, it doesn't have any kind of general text on intellectual property, but it does have some specific text on some open models of sharing technology. It has some text on technology transfer, and it has this kind of curious text on Indigenous intellectual property as well. So I would argue, really the Pact for the Future could have been more ambitious in tackling intellectual property and sustainable development head on, and embodying Antonio Guterres' ideals of protecting the global commons and having mechanisms to share global public goods. And I think it's a bit of a shame that some of those concepts have drifted away during the negotiations. Thank you very much.